I'll just firstly start by welcoming back all of our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Edge podcast, brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter. This week, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by David Drew. David, thank you so much for giving up some of your valuable time this Friday morning. It's great to have you on the show.
Pleasure, Charlie. Great to be with you.
Fantastic stuff, David. So, right, we've got sort of 20 minutes or so to give our listeners and viewers, a sort of a whistle-stop tour, if you like, of you and your background and experience. Start wherever you like, David. Some of our guests go back to literally the childhood sort of formation experiences, and others start a little bit later into higher education and perhaps early part of their career. But give our listeners that aren't aware of you and your work an idea of what you've done so far in your career.
Well, so I think it's I'm very privileged to, I think, have trod a very interesting and diverse path over the last sort of 50 years, which is quite scary when you sort of see a number like that on a birthday card. But yeah, my background is, as listeners can probably tell from my accent, is not from the UK. Although sort of family ties and everything stretch back sort of generations to the UK. I was born, as were my parents, in South Africa, and hence I have sort of the unusual background of having been born in Africa, lived in Africa most of my life, and having recently moved to the UK. So I think as a child growing up in Africa, you always create a special connection with the environment, and I was very lucky. So I do think it's worth going back to childhood, because I think that's where sort of love for the environment. And I think what's interesting is in those days it used to be called environmentalism. Nowadays it's sustainability or ESG, or back to sustainability, or whatever the name keeps changing to. But I was lucky to have a couple of people in my life who sort of really showed me the value of nature and the value of animals and environment. And that kind of lit a spark in me, which I think probably died a little as I sort of did what most of us do, which is go and get a degree and join the working world and sort of, grow up and get on with real life. But it was always there, and it's always been something that sort of I've been passionate about. And I think I've been fortunate in my career to somewhat come back full circle to sort of where I started. And it sort of really started of all things with two influential people. One was a teacher who got us, or probably the whole class almost, into bird watching at the age of 10. And that was kind of sort of where sort of it started, going out and trying to accumulate a list of birds. And I was fortunate to grow up in an amazing environment with, sort of 500-600 bird species on my doorstep, which I only realized coming to the northern hemisphere is very rare and very unusual. So kind of the combination of being in the environment where that passion could really grow was great. And then my other
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just so that our listeners and viewers can really get a sense of the context of this, whereabouts in South Africa are you growing up at?
So I grew up on the coast of South Africa in a town or city, I guess, called Durban. I think it's interesting because it's sort of very tropical. For those of you who have seen snakes in the city, you bump into a taxi driver and someone say, "Oh, South Africa, very dangerous country." And some people go, "Yeah, well, countries are dangerous." "Yeah, so many snakes." And you go, "Okay, that's not where I thought the conversation was going." But yes, Durban is the snakes in the city town. So I grew up in Durban, and had snakes in the garden, had snakes in our house, kept some as pets and things like that. So there was always that kind of like crazy, go and catch a snake in the garden and then decide that you can keep it in your bedroom type thing.
Wow.
And that's, I guess that's just, it felt very normal, but it's sort of, I guess in hindsight isn't. And then I got into a passion for gardening, which I think was initiated by my grandmother, and a passion in for indigenous gardening and indigenous fish, and sort of everything that was, I guess where it really clicked for me was this understanding that there was a connection between what we did as people and how we interacted with nature and the consequences of that. And it probably started with a project that it was asked to do on something called invasive alien plants, which I think is something that I think UK would be sort of Japanese knotweed. Now in South Africa, there's probably 25 Japanese knotweeds that we have to worry about. And they are, by Japanese knotweed statements, and we'll get onto this, I think, later, by the standards that are applied in this country, the sort of level invasive plants is just off the scale. So it became very sort of real that the things that we've done over the last 50 years, bringing in different plants, bringing in different animals into the environment, were having a real impact on what was there and what should be there. And so, this sort of spark of breeding indigenous fish and growing plants that should have been in the environment in which I lived. And so I like to say, I grew up. Go, Charlie.
Oh, David, I'm sorry. I was just going to sorry, I interrupted you there. But and this was your grandmother who was particularly aware of and sort of, imparted her wisdom and understanding of these issues to you as you were growing up. Is this
so where this? She wasn't as much of a passion about specifically indigenous plants, but right. She loved plants, and she, not many grandmothers will buy a child a cactus garden. For example, because, something like that. But it was this understanding of plants that and their interaction with the environment, and things like stapelias. I mean, explaining to me that stapelias had the I don't know if you probably come in the sort of rotting meat plant, the flower that smells like rotting meat. Yeah. And with the excitement that we bought it and grew it until the flower opened and it stank and the flies came into it. These are the kinds of sort of unusual things that you sort of get exposed to. And so that kind of connection with the environment had always been strong. And I think it dwindled over time. I went and studied engineering. And at the end of engineering, I was kind of torn back to go back to sort of biochem at those days, biochemical engineering, this idea of alternative ways to sort of run, let's call it chemical processes using enzymes and sort of more natural methodology was just emerging. So that was quite an exciting part of the field at the time. But then I got offered a job and I thought it's too good to turn down. And I took the job and kind of went into industry. I got a job with Unilever, which was one of the best companies in Durban at the time. And so started, as so many people do, on a sort of typical career, graduate career, aiming for the next promotion, getting the next job, moving cities. And it was sort of only later that through that I managed to come back to the point where I started to find the link back to sort of the link between business and environment. And that came to me through, I ended up working for a beverage part of Unilever at the time, which was making plastic bottles. And as you can imagine, this was sort of in the early 2000s, plastic bottles were sort of really becoming noticeable, and there was a lot of pressure to act. And at that point, I got involved in, to a lesser extent, an organization called Petco, which many years later I came to serve on the board of. And it was about how do we solve the problem of collection and recycling. And so from that, I ended up working in a plastics business. I worked in a plastic business for a long time. And as I said, I used to make responsible for a business that made 4 billion bits of plastic a year. And after 12 years, decided that I needed to do something else. I really had one of those sort of, whether you want to call it a midlife crisis or a Damascene moment, where I decided that I needed to change. I needed to change my career. It so happened that we built up the business into something really big, and we'd sold it. And so
and David, sorry,
yeah.
let me understand that a little bit more, because I think that's fascinating. What was it? Those 12 years, you mentioned midlife crisis, but what was the thinking in your mind about the need for the change? Was it you were just fatigued doing the same thing, or you felt like you would run its natural course? Like what was it that stimulated the need for a change of direction?
Sure. That's a really good question. I think it's probably a combination of things. I think that one of the things that probably rubbed a little raw was ultimately in space, we were incentivized to sell as much as we could, to expand the use of our products into every potential sort of application that we could find. I think we were comfortable that there were certain applications that for which we were making products that were fully recyclable, being well collected, and as I said, at that stage, becoming far more involved in the support for the collection and recycling, sort of gave you comfort. But there were also applications where you thought, is this really a good idea, or was this just an excuse to grow the business? And I think that started to feel a little bit uncomfortable. I remember going to visit my cousins who live in the Sierra Nevada mountains in America, and seeing, just sort of recognizing that there was this alternative place where people weren't always chasing more, and and I think it kind of gave me the feeling that I needed to do something different, and that different needed to be something to do with sustainability. So I came back from that holiday and quit my job, not knowing what I was going to do. And I think as happens in life, when you kind of make opportunities and create space, Petco, which at that point, I don't want to lie and exaggerate my CV, as some others have done, but I'd say I'd probably been on the board for 3 or 4 years as a director. And to some extent, I felt that I hadn't necessarily always had the time, being a sort of, executive in a business, had the time to actually give as much as I could to the organization. I'd certainly probably done my fair share. And when I quit my job, I suddenly had time. Sort of typical sort of garden leave type situation. And so I said, look, let me help. I've got time. I've got capacity for the first time in many years. Let me help you. And so I got a lot more involved in what was at that point quite a turning point for the South African packaging and collection and recycling space. There was new regulation, very similar to what's happening in the UK at the moment. This sort of new regulation coming in, industry and government grappling with finding the right solution. And an organization like Petco, which had been in place for sort of 15 years, or maybe not quite 15 years at that time, but sort of a mature organization, was now being affected by a change in regulation, which I think everyone agreed was going to be for the good, but nevertheless, change is always difficult. And so I got involved. And it was through that a colleague who was part of Petco at the time then came to me and said, what are you going to do next? And I said, I don't know. I've got a few sort of discussions. And he said, why don't you come work for Coca-Cola? I was like, what am I going to do for Coca-Cola? And he said, you can do my job. I said, what are you going to do? He said, no, he's going to go and do his job somewhere else. And he needs someone who understands, what it is that we've been doing, and what is the journey that we've been on from a sort of collection and recycling sustainability base. And he said, very few people know what we know. And therefore, if I want to go, you can replace me. And so, as luck would have it, I now ended up in a formal sustainability role, as opposed to sort of sustainability being my side hustle. And so it wasn't, let's say, to be 100% clear, it wasn't the best and most lucrative career step from a point of view, but it felt like a step in the right direction. And absolutely thoroughly enjoyed the sort of detour, the sort of, the happenstance that took me in that direction, and have really, really enjoyed getting more involved. And I think that as much as I clearly went into the world of work and really focused on my career and building a business, I think that gives me perhaps a very strong base to deal with the sustainability challenges that we now face. And I think that it gives me a different lens to a lot of people who kind of come, let's say, go and study sustainability and come directly into the working world as sustainability people, because they, to some extent, sustainability and the challenge with it is that it has to coexist in this sort of environment where businesses have to operate, people have to eat, things need to happen. And it's finding that balance, which is so difficult.
Do And David, on that, because I think that's absolutely fascinating, and thinking about guests that we've had on the show, I think you're absolutely right that there's almost a categorization that can go along in terms of the sort of innate sustainability expert who's only ever known anything other than, and those that have transitioned, if you like, throughout their career. Do you think, I think you were kind of alluding to it here, but do you think that pragmatism, if you like, around understanding sustainability in the broader commercial context, do you think that's something that's generally missing now, as we've had more people be specialists in sustainability from the outset? Is that a concern of yours, if you like?
I would say probably yes, but maybe important to sort of give a context. I think that I think there are, and by no means unique. I think there are a lot of people who've drifted towards sustainability, and so there are people who have a similar story of coming out of industry and have that kind of balance. There are also a lot of people who don't. I think what's probably the challenge is finding the balance between, let's call it the optimists who are sort of looking to change the world, and the pragmatists who are saying, okay, but. And I think that possibly now in the sort of in this, to some extent, a bit of a watershed moment, I believe, is this sort of, there's definitely been a change. I don't know, we know what to call it. I put an article at the end of last year, which sort of framed it as a sort of new era of ESG. And someone promptly told me, well, you can't call it ESG anymore. I was like, well, then it's really a new era, because now it's not even called ESG. But there is a change, and I think that the change is coming back towards a bit more, okay, but how do we actually make this work? And I think that that's probably going to require a little bit more of the sort of experience and understanding, and a little bit less of the sort of the optimism and the theory. But the two are always going to coexist, because if you don't have both sides, the risk is you go too far in one direction or the other, I think.
I couldn't agree. I'm pleased that you positioned like that. I couldn't agree with you more. It's as with most things, it's a question of balance. I want to ask you, David, though, a personal question about this experience at this point where you found yourself having moved from industry. You beautifully described how, as a young person, as a child growing up, that you had these very kind of sensory experiences, if you like, of nature and the environment and of wildlife around you. And that really helped frame sort of your view of how you saw the world, and you were influenced by your grandmother, etc., and your teacher who got you into bird watching. Finding yourself at Coca-Cola, working in a role that was your first sort of finite sustainability role, if you like, or designated or focused sustainability role. How did that make you feel? How did that affect you personally in terms of your work?
So it's interesting. I mean, I was asked, I mean, you can imagine, and to be clear, I don't work for Coca-Cola anymore, but you can imagine that in a lot of spaces, being the face of, let's call it big plastic, the world's biggest plastic polluter, can come with a lot of baggage. And I think the one thing that made me comfortable was, I mean, there are a lot of things where when you get right down to it and you see the impact, and I mean, we'll probably get into this a little bit later, the impact that big business, as much as big business is maligned by so many people, the resources and the conscience to some extent of big business, which people underestimate, can have an amazingly positive impact, particularly in the emerging market. And so the things that people never see behind the scenes of what, and it's not only Coca-Cola, there are a lot of sort of, we worked on multiple sort of cross-industry forums. There's good work being done out there. And that's the kind of thing that I think when you know that you're part of it, can be extremely rewarding. But at the same time, I also think what's important is to understand almost the heart or the basis for what's happening in the organization. And I think big business and Coke and others, for example, have had a lot of criticism over the last, I want to say 30 years, believe it or not, because there was sort of criticism of people's environmental commitments that some businesses made in the 90s, for example. And I think what changed in the teens is that sustainability became something that businesses actually were going to give and put resource behind, as opposed to having sustainability being a sort of lipstick on a pig type brief that people in, and to, you're part of the greenwashing charter. That's exactly what it was in some circles, and probably is still today in some companies. But I think I always felt comfortable that wasn't what I was being asked to do, and that I think gave me the conscience to say, yes, you may not always agree with what we do, or you may not always understand the impact that we're having, and you feel free to criticize it and to challenge it. But I'm at least comfortable that I know that I have the backing of an organization that actually wants to make things better, within the sort of bounds of what they can do. And I think that that's a really important thing for people going into the sustainability spaces. What is your role to put lipstick on a pig, or is your role to actually sort of fix something and make a difference?
And David, on that point, because I think it's fascinating, what was it about your experience at Coke that gave you that confidence that this wasn't just, a CSR activity? This wasn't just a sort of putting a plaster over something. This was something whereby you were being encouraged to sort of instigate fundamental change. Like what were those experiences? Was it the leaders around you? Was it
absolutely? I think that comes directly from the leaders around you. I mean, you can tell whether the CEO in that case, or I think business unit president or whatever, wanted to know the answer and wanted to know what needed to be done. Didn't always give me what I wanted. There's always restrictions and limitations, but at least you didn't feel at any point that he was saying, I'm not supporting it because I don't believe that it's worth doing. I'll support it as much as I can, and this is important to me. And I think that in businesses, that's created by obviously having the right people in the right jobs and having sort of enough understanding of what is important from a sustainability perspective through businesses. But it's also, I think now, and this is part of the sort of new era, is that sustainability and sustainability goals are now becoming so much more central to the performance valuation of a business. So, what's really changed is the promises that business make today are promises that they are much more likely to keep. So even when you look at them and you say, well, that's less than the promise they made 5 years ago, if they're more likely to deliver on it than they were to deliver on a promise 5 years ago that they were never going to keep, then in a sort of perverse way, it's actually progress. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment is that these promises are now so much more important because you have to keep them. And therefore, when a business says it wants to make everything recyclable, or it wants to collect this, or it wants to reduce its carbon footprint, or it wants to reduce its water usage or whatever, those things are now things that get measured and reported consistently from year to year, as opposed to the sort of, my paradigm is that a lot of sustainability reports 5 years ago were a highlights reel. Okay. There were a highlights reel of whatever movie was showing, as opposed to the audited financial statements, which would be the same format year on year, opening chairman's report, CEO's thing, balance sheet, income statement, adjustment. It was very formulaic and very consistent from year to year. Sustainability report 1 year would focus on sustainable agriculture, and the next year would focus on plastic, and then would focus on renewable energy. And if you went through 4 or 5 financial statements, you're very difficult to sort of make a comparison. That's changing. And I think that's kind of what's leading this point where sustainability professionals can feel like what they do matters, and that they have the backing of leadership.
That was brilliantly explained, David. I thank you for giving us that sort of that 5-year view. Essentially, we've got more realistic, and we're beginning to compare apples with apples, which is a sort of
Absolutely.
a liberating way to approach the sustainability function, I suppose. David, I've done the classic thing of obliterating my 20-minute mark on talking about you, but as expected, let's keep going though. Talk to us about the end of your time. What happens next after Coke, and what you've done sort of throughout the rest of that period since.
Yeah, so I mean, myself and my family moved to the UK a little over 2 years ago, and that was really sort of a sad farewell, but an opportunity for my wife's career, which meant a change of direction for myself. The sort of the tried answers is, I say, I used to love I was passionate about gardening and indigenous plants. My wife wanted an English country garden, so we compromised and moved here. So the reality is that we had an opportunity as a family and we took it, which sort of again pushed me in a new direction. Very sad to sort of have left the role that I was in, but clearly I couldn't look after Africa from Europe. But at the moment I'm in the consulting industry, and I really, I'm doing similar work for a range of clients, but sort of in a space where probably one of the most dynamic and exciting points of time in this sort of sustainability journey, trying to unpick what's important, what to do, how to do it right, and balance, as always, this challenge of delivering a better outcome without breaking the business, or making promises you can't keep. And so to that extent, I think I'm comfortable that sort of niche in which we sit now is this space where commercial reality and sustainable ambition kind of meet, and hopefully adding some value.
Indeed. I'm more than sure of that. David, brilliant. Well, look, again, we've scratched the surface, I know, and we'll obviously be linking to David's LinkedIn on all of our materials. So those that are interested in seeing all of the other various sort of stages of David's career so far can go and have a look. Before I move on to the article, though, David, I'm fascinated to always ask the question of somebody of your stage and of your experience. When you think about the rest of your career and you think about what you want to achieve, just talk us through that. Like, what would success, if you like, throughout the rest of your career look like?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's probably going to be similar to where I am now. It could be. It's definitely this intersection between sustainability and sort of commercial reality, and that's where I think that I can add value. I mean, I'm very passionate about, as we'll probably get into now, about the waste management challenges and collection and recycling. Mm-hmm. So working in those kind of spaces. But I also think that what I've also enjoyed in particular, and I have a bit of an opportunity to do that in my current role, is working with sort of incredibly talented youngsters in the current organization, and helping them sort of fast track a little bit of this journey, perhaps, and to some extent imparting that knowledge, because I guess what's I probably realized over time I quite enjoy the teaching and the sharing part of the journey as well. I think it's, what I've realized is a lot of these concepts are quite, I don't say they're difficult, but I think we could make them easier to understand for people. And I think if we can help people understand things better, we'll help them make better choices. And to some extent, I think that everything's about choices. And this is probably the bigger challenge that the sort of society faces, is that it can't be and this and this and that. And that's, it's kind of like dealing with children. You unless you present them with which would you like, either this or that, it's not a real life decision to say, oh, I want to do this and I want to do that and I want to do this. I want to have 100% renewable energy and 100% reliable energy and 100% clean environment and cheap everything. These things are all connected in their trade-offs. So how do we make the better choices in order to get the best result? And I think that's if I could leave any sort of impact on that, and that people can say, you know what, that was really something that I understood and sort of was able to unpack because of what how I was able to help them. For example, looking at something as complicated as returnable packaging, and understanding when does it work and when does it not work. And I really enjoy the mental challenge of first figuring it out for myself and then trying to find a way to explain it in a way that can be interpreted and used by others to achieve the right outcomes. So that's a difficult question, Charlie, to throw at me, but I hope that it makes sense in hindsight.
That very much did. I'm here to ask you the questions that catch you slightly off guard. I think it's a fascinating point there. It's almost like it's the whole notion of a trade-off when talking about sustainability is like a dirty word. It's almost as dirty a word as talking about profit in the context of modern business. But yeah, I think you're so spot on. It comes back to that point about pragmatism, and it comes back to, I think that's so crucial to be, let's be grown up about these things. Let's be grown up about these conversations and the trade-offs that are at play. David, let's move on now. Would you mind possibly providing a bit of a summary of the World Economic Forum piece? I think it was from September 2023 that we'd been discussing pre-show. Would you mind just summarizing that for our listeners and viewers, and then perhaps just picking out for you whatever the most interesting pieces were from that article?
So I think the article kind of goes into a subject which is something that is going to come up again and again. And I think there's a number of elements to it. The first one is how does the sustainability journey of the developed world, and in this case Europe, let's say, sort of with a focus on Europe, how does it interact with the developing and emerging economies? And I think that it's, to some extent, it's an interesting article, but I do think that to some extent it's a little bit ill-informed, and I say that not with malice, but I think it's very difficult for people who haven't lived and experienced Africa and really sort of felt it to really be able to prescribe the answer for Africa. And I think that what the article, if you read it, is trying to say, where's this kind of win-win that we can negotiate or develop with Africa? So Africa's clearly got a lot of minerals, and particularly the critical minerals that the energy transition is needing. And as anyone who understands the mass of the energy transition will understand, that the amount of mining and minerals that is going to be required to achieve the kind of goals, or even a fraction of the goals that are being set, is enormous. And it's orders of magnitude above where we are today, particularly for some of the critical minerals, sort of the lithium and the copper and the cobalt and things like that. So there's this enormous need for materials. Europe's identified that Africa has a lot of these materials, but at the same time is recognizing that there's a challenge. How can you not repeat the sort of history of extracting goods from raw materials from Africa and leaving Africa in no better off than it was before? And so it's trying to say, is there a way where through this energy transition and the minerals that we need, how can we lift Africa at the same time as achieve our goals? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely what the outcome should be. The problem, I think, is the lens with which you look at it. And the one thing I've realized over time is that it's so difficult to understand conflicting points of view, because you're not able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand their paradigm. So whether it's the sort of example that really brought it out for me was a historian who was explaining that during the Cold War, the USSR's mindset was the reaction to NATO and to the West was formed by what they would do in opposition, and equally on the other side. So whilst NATO really had no intent of driving tanks across sort of East Germany, that was not the assumption from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union's paradigm was completely different. And I think that when Europe looks at Africa and says, okay, well, we're going to help you along, we're going to do the energy transition, and we're going to help you transition to green energy, for example. The paradigm is still that they're missing is that, well, that's easy for you to say because you're already rich. Okay. And this is so important because just yesterday or the day before, I was listening to sort of some feedback from news from South Africa, and there's a lot of debate around exploiting natural gas and exploiting and closing down. What is the impact of closing down coal power stations and things like that? And the important thing, and that the article correctly identifies, as I said, I think it says 600 million Africans are sort of energy starved or energy deprived, let's say it, however you want to say it, is basically means you don't have the energy you need when you need it. And fundamentally, until that's addressed, it's very difficult to look at all these other things. So it's very difficult there's nothing against, and most African economies will jump at green energy, but most importantly, they're not jumping at the green, they're jumping at the energy. Okay. And I think that this is something that's so difficult to understand. And I feel privileged almost to be in a place where I've seen both sides of the equation. I think when last did you not have power at your house? For more than 5 minutes?
Yeah.
In South Africa, you had roughly 14 years or a bit more of what was euphemistically called load shedding, which basically means there's not enough supply from the grid, and the energy supply company will nominate that your power will go off for 2 hours or 4 hours or 8 hours or whatever, and then it'll come back on for a few hours and then it'll go off. So basically, it's intermittent supply. Yep. If that happened today in any European country for one day, there'd be absolute pandemonium and a change of government. Okay?
So true.
So that kind of paradigm is really difficult to understand. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that as a South African, we were very incensed, and it probably kind of frog in the boiling pot. It started off slowly, and by sort of 2023, when in fact I wasn't there, it got to the 140 days or something out of the year when there was load shedding. So basically half the time there was power off at least for a few hours a day.
And David, before segueing away from that, why was that? Why was it getting worse?
So there was probably two things. The one was that the economy grew from after apartheid. The economy grew really strongly. Let's be clear. You can look at the facts and see from about 1996 to about 2005, the economy really boomed. To some extent, that was built on the back of a global boom, but it was also sort of this potential energy that was coming out of South Africa. So you had real economic growth. You had increasing access to electricity for people who had never had electricity before. So there's kind of this raising the bar. But at the same time, there was almost no expansion in electricity supply. And obviously the power stations at the point which were mostly built in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s were starting to get older and older and older, and some of them reaching end of life. So to some extent, you had this sort of fall off of supply and increase in demand. And it was predicted. It was predicted long ahead to say by 2009 we're going to run into trouble. And sure as nuts, in 2009 it happened. And basically there was supposed to be new capacity built from about 2005, and it just wasn't done in time. So you actually ended up in a space where the demand supply gap became very, very small. And then what happened is all you needed was a breakdown here or a breakdown there, or an interruption for some reason. At the first time it happened, it was blamed on wet coal because it rained a lot in February, and suddenly the coal was too wet to be burnt or something like that. But the bottom line was that sort of it crept up on the country to the point where you had to switch off the power to certain places to prevent the grid from failing. Now, in reality, if you compare that situation, even as bad as our South Africans thought it was and complained like crazy, it's still a lot better than a lot of other countries in Africa. A lot better. My Nigerian colleagues, when I was at Coke, used to laugh at of saying that we had a load shedding schedule, and they would just say, "Well, the power comes on sometimes and it goes off other times. It's not, when it's there, we take it." As opposed to, at least we had a bit more of an orderly process for it. But the reality is that when you're trying to run a business in that environment, you recognize just how difficult it is to run a business. And at that point, we were running a plastics business, and plastics requires energy. You're melting plastic, and when the power goes off, the plastic goes hard in the machine, and you can't, if the machine stops in the middle of a cycle, it can damage itself and things like that. So suddenly you have a real problem making and maintaining businesses of all sorts. And, it's all very well to say, oh, well, just get a generator. But if you're running a bank, generator makes absolute sense. Let's say electricity is probably 1 or 2% of your total costs. Running a generator, not a big problem. Where you're running a manufacturing business and electricity is 30% of your costs, you can't run a generator and make money, not unless your client is willing to pay for it. And so a diesel generator, I think probably when we started using them in 2017, was costing at least 10 times what it cost us to buy electricity from the grid. And electricity was about 30% of our costs. So you can imagine we were basically running a charity at that point.
Your hands are just incredibly tied, aren't they? And you're in an incredible predicament. And the point being, David, coming back to what you were saying earlier, is that from a European perspective, there's just this misunderstanding of the fundamental concern at play, which is not what source of energy are we looking at here, but the fact, have we got consistent and reliable energy in order to allow us to operate, essentially? Absolutely.
And if you want to do, the article speaks about how can Africa, let's say, beneficiate some of these minerals within Africa. Beneficiation takes even more energy. So running a mine is energy intensive, depending what kind of mining it is. You can imagine interrupted power is not great if you've got people, in the case of South Africa, 2,000-3,000 meters underground, relying on lifts and fans and things to live and breathe. So, there's a health and safety issue to it, but there's also, if you're trying to run a smelter to refine metals, that's hugely energy intensive. And so those kind of processes, beneficiation, particularly on minerals and metals, are very energy intensive. And if you don't have power just to keep the lights on for your population, it's very difficult to then say, we're going to do this great project and we're going to, beneficiate cobalt.
And it therefore just has that complete tone deafness to it when you get the Europeans turning up and saying, as you say, here's this great project, we're going to achieve all these wonderful outcomes through the frame of reference that we in the North and in Europe have. And then that's just going to land incredibly poorly for those on the ground in the South and in Africa, saying you've completely missed the mark here. Let me ask David on that then.
Yeah.
And I know that the article talked about, I think, the EU's Global Gateway Initiative, 150 billion euros worth of investment, and I think the African Continental Free Trade Area and all of those sorts of initiatives. If I was to say to you, look, you've got a blank sheet of paper, David, and you can just completely rewrite essentially the way that Europe and the North would ultimately look to engage with the South, and in particular, let's take the instance of Africa, in order to create that truly valuable, supportive and nurturing dynamic and partnership between the two continents. What would that, I know it's a $64 trillion question, but what would that look like? What would be the key characteristics of it?
So I think cheap, reliable energy is number one. If that energy can be cheap and clean and reliable, that would be great. And so, for example, things like, and this is, where there are opportunities. If you look at I love Google Earth. One of my favorite parts of a Coke job was looking at waters and watersheds and understanding, sort of Africa's river networks. And through that time, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was being constructed. So you'd follow it on whatever satellite pictures you could see and see how it's growing and being filled and sort of where it's going to end up and how big it's going to be. And having businesses in Ethiopia, you could see the impact of that. So that dam and the power from it is going to change Ethiopia more than almost anything else. Ethiopia is going to have basically emission-free power, and it's going to have lots of it. It's going to have power that it can export to its neighbors. And so it is possible, in parts, to find that sort of Goldilocks space where you can tick all the boxes. It's not possible everywhere. Most people know Africa is a pretty dry place, so hydropower is not going to work everywhere. Really? But something like that, when you see the impact of something like that dam, you see that the power and that's going to come from it is going to revolutionize the Ethiopian economy, which is already in a pretty good space. I think if anyone hasn't been to Addis Ababa, I challenge you to go and have a look at it, because it really is probably way beyond your expectations. It's an interesting combination of sort of developing and sort of first world environments living sort of in the same space together. But it really, it has that energy of economy that's going to grow, and that dam's going to really make a difference. So where are the other opportunities like that? And I think the biggest one, particularly for Southern Africa, which is more constrained, is the Grand Inga Dam. It's something that's been on the cards, I would guess, since maybe, I can't remember when Inga 1 was built, maybe in 60s or 70s. It's really a long time. And they've been talking about sort of Ingas sort of 2, 3, and 4, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's almost like I want to say it's a dam. It's more of a run of river hydro scheme on the Congo, on the lower Congo. And it's not a massive dam in the sort of traditional sense, because the river is just so big, you don't have to build a dam. You just have to put a turbine in the way of the water. But you've got a, sort of 30 to 50, maybe a bit more meters of drop there, and just the most staggering amount of water flowing all the time. And that kind of and this is one of the reasons why, for example, I think South Africa was hedging their bets about what to invest in, because Inga was supposed to come on stream, 2014 or something like that, and be supplying into this, what they call the Southern African Power Pool. And it just hasn't happened. But that's in the deal.
And why? Why hasn't that happened?
I think it's a combination of issues. It's probably in historically it's in the DRC, or it's in the border between I think it's entirely in the DRC, or maybe there's a little bit of Congo Brazzaville involved, but it's largely in the DRC. And as most people know, the DRC had from the 90s till the sort of noughties had quite a tumultuous political situation. So building something like that is fraught with risk. But it shouldn't be something that can't be overcome. So I think it's probably more political. I think there's still possibly some environmental concerns. You never build a dam without flooding something and affecting something. So, but I would guess it's probably more money and politics that are preventing it from happening. But it would be an amazing way to create the sort of reliable, clean energy in proper quantities. I don't think it's quite Three Gorges Dam scale, but it's thousands of megawatts.
And David, just to sort of bring back to sort of the theme of the article, what could Europe, and I'm using massive generalizations here, but when we think about Europe's approach, if you like, to supporting Africa and supporting the continent and supporting the global South, what could it be doing, if you like, in its approach, in its way of supporting or partnering up with that in order to facilitate the likes of the second dam being developed?
So, I mean, I think the parable of the dam is really that it's something that will allow cheap, reliable energy, which will allow economic growth. And I think more than anything, what's missing is this acknowledgement that to achieve the ambition of protecting the environment, you need to first be comfortable in your own skin and be comfortable where you live and have an environment is something that isn't on the agenda of the poorest of the poor living in a slum in Kinshasa. And I think more than anything, and this is probably something that you do see in Africa that you don't see, probably similar in other parts of the world, but the real the direct environmental damage of poverty on the environment. So it's, poor waste management, it's sewage, it's sort of just habitat destruction on a micro scale, and that can be so damaging to the ecosystems that rely on that space. But those things, waste management is expensive. It's really expensive, and to some extent, I think this is something that people underappreciate, is that Africa doesn't not clean up its waste because it doesn't want to. It's the waste management that Europe has costs a lot of money. It's currently funded by taxes and EPR schemes and things like that, but it is funded by the people who have a standard of living multiple times the average African. And therefore, if you want similar outcomes, you have to raise everyone. And you're not going to raise everyone. And I guess where I worry is that in some cases, things that make sense in Europe being pushed towards Africa are not fit for purpose because the environment is just so different and the economic realities are so different.
Well, give us an example. Give us an example of that. I understand the economic realities being different, but what would be an example of something that we would look to push, if you like, from the global north on the global south that just wouldn't be environmentally relevant?
Well, okay, so maybe environmentally relevant is maybe less of an issue, but for example, the one that I'm quite familiar with is there was always a lot of pressure on a number of African markets to implement the kinds of collection and recycling schemes that you see in Europe. So something called deposit return schemes, consumers pay a deposit, bottles go. So it was really trying to address single-use plastics in the beverage space, which obviously you can imagine Coca-Cola was sort of front and center of. And the issue is not that deposit return schemes don't work. The issue is they do work. They work very well. In Germany and Norway, they collect over 95% of all the bottles. The issue is that they're really expensive. And they are so expensive, and probably this is the way to think about it, is that just operating the collection machine costs more per bottle than the bottle is worth. Okay. Now, I mean, that's if you're willing to say the most important thing is for me to achieve the collection of the bottles and money is not an object, then I can put the money in until I collect 95% of the bottles and I will have done a great job. But if you're in a space where at the moment, let's say, a lot of that collection is done by informal collectors, they are collecting a bottle and they are taking that bottle and selling it probably in UK terms for a penny a bottle, in order to live and eat. And now, if you said, I think you should implement the system that we have in Norway, in Kenya, and it's going to cost you 4 pennies a bottle to collect a bottle that's currently worth 1 penny that someone is collecting on their own, sort of with their own labor and selling. Effectively, you're saying, I'm going to take something that has some value today and I'm going to just turn it into a cost system tomorrow. And so that's an example of something that I think is completely not fit for purpose in an African environment. So there may be alternatives to it, and there's sort of lots of discussion about what are the other options, but enforcing a system that is affordable in Europe into Africa is really difficult. And I think there are also probably some other things that are going to be, I don't know if they're really I'd say the unintended consequences of some of the policy in Europe. So, which is also covered a little bit in the article, things around like CBAM and emissions trading, and what are the things that Europe's trying to do to improve the carbon footprint of their economy by saying they want to improve the carbon footprint of the places that are supplying the raw materials, or it could be ingredients, or it could be food, whether it's tea or sugar or whatever else it is. But if the environments that are growing and mining those materials are not capable of, let's say, lifting the boat to meet let's say the highest standard, and then the supply moves somewhere else, then to some extent, by applying a bar that's a little bit too high for, a country in Africa, you effectively cut them out of your supply chain. That industry collapses, people get poorer, people care less about the environment, the outcomes become worse. And so it's this kind of applying standards in a lot of different ways that are fit for purpose in Europe, but not necessarily fit for purpose in everywhere, let's say. And it's not because Europe wants to create chaos or destroy livelihoods in Africa. It's just it's the butterfly flapping its wings in Brussels that is leading to someone losing their job in Mozambique. That's the difficulty, and that's why sustainability is challenging.
It's complex and clumsy and difficult, and I think you've nailed it perfectly, David. You've introduced it brilliantly, and I think there's, from my point of view, from what you've described, there's just so much nuance and there's so much appreciation and understanding that needs to be had of the kind of local conditions or influences at play on how we go about implementing these things, and how we can have grand ambitions, I think, for where different parts of the world might be able to get to, but we need to be sympathetic to the context in which they're operating. David, you brilliantly explained all of this. Thank you so much for hand-holding me through some of these big themes. We're now going to conclude with the magic wand question. So, David, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Sure. The commercial world. Probably look, I think that in the commercial world, my answer would have to be payment terms. That's a very strange thing to say, but I really believe that if you probably, from what I've seen, one of the ways, and this sort of speaks to small business and the small player and the business at the other end of the world trying to export their products. Payment terms are the, people always talked about the bond market was what broke the apartheid South Africa. It was the sort of invisible hand that had the ultimate say. It was much more powerful than the politicians or anyone else. And I think, like debt and payment terms, abusing the small business by paying them slowly is probably one of the most underappreciated difficulties that we face globally. And the irony is that the people that do it are the companies that need the money the least. In other words, they're the businesses that have the money. And for the sake of chasing a KPI, which is debtors days or net working capital or whatever it is, they are encouraged to push slow payment down the value chain to people on which could end up being, sort of small farmers or small business owners or whoever else it is. And so, and I know it has been contemplated in some markets as to sort of put a limit on something like 30 days or 60 days and say no more than that, because you do need terms, let's be clear. But just to put some limits on it, I think is just this economic change that could unleash so much value, particularly in small business and particularly in places far away on the supply chain, which people forget about. So it's a very unsustainable answer, but I think it'd probably be my magic one question, if that makes sense.
David, I love it. We often don't get, this is your show 104 of The Responsible Edge, and to get a completely unique magic wand suggestion is always an absolute delight. What a brilliant suggestion. Can I ask you just a direct question on it, though? It seems so obvious that that it seems an unethical practice to for certainly smaller organizations, ones that, as you say, really need that funding to be beholden to these payment terms, these longer and longer payment terms from their larger partners, if you like, in the supply or the value chain. What's stopping regulation from being enforced that sets a particular sort of limit, if you like, on payment terms?
I don't know that there's something stopping it. I think it's something that, if you were one of those president for a day questions, you could do it. I mean, it's of all the other things that we regulate and limit, this seems like something that would be not unreasonable to do. But it's just, I mean, I would guess that there might be some levels of international trade where it becomes a little bit difficult, but certainly in a traditional local environment, it's something that I think would be manageable. Certainly, if you said 7 days or something, I think that wouldn't have that would just be impractical. But even a limit of 60 days would really help businesses, because what I learned in my time was that when payment terms are 90 days, 120 days, and in some cases 150 days, businesses grow themselves broke. The more they succeed, the more working capital they need, and they end up just running out of money. They've got lots of people who promise to pay them, and then of course people come and say, "Oh, we'll factor your debts and whatever else." But it just becomes sort of the beginning of the end in my experience. So I don't think there's anything really stopping us from doing it.
David, it's a brilliant suggestion. Even just down to that, I'm just thinking about the sort of the personal experiences that people go through in terms of the concern, if you like, over payment coming in, and all of the wasted energy and effort, if you like, that goes into chasing or goes into trying to renegotiate, etc., and all of the kind of I guess the anxiety associated with it. I think it's a very, very good suggestion, David. David, I'm sorry, we're going to have to conclude there. We've hit over an hour, which was totally anticipated with you, I have to say. It's been brilliant to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, pleasure. And of course, as would happen, that's when the dog starts barking.
And I was going to say, who's decided to join us at the very end here? Brilliant.
Yeah, he's been very quiet up until now. So apologies for that, but that's what happens. I think it's probably the mailman or Amazon or something like that. Yeah, Charlie, it's been great. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting. Sorry.
This has been one of the smoothest episodes going, and then we've got to give a name to the dog that's joined us.
His name is Solo. My son, he's my son's dog. He was born during a Star Wars revival phase a few years ago. So he's Han Solo. But
Fantastic. Well, David, after a brilliant conversation, I love the fact that we managed to finish with a reference to Han Solo and to Star Wars. What a brilliant whistle stop tour. Thanks again for joining us, David.
Thanks, Charlie. That's you soon. Bye.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to David Drew, former Senior Director of Sustainability at Coca-Cola Africa, for sharing his insights on how businesses can align sustainability with long-term strategy and impact. Today, David and I explored a really interesting article titled How Africa and Europe Together Can Sow the Seeds of the Green Transition, discussing the role of cross-continental collaboration, the critical need for equitable partnerships, and how Africa's green economy can drive sustainable industrialization. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Andrew Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit andrewgreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.